Hi everybody, welcome to my February wrap-up. The first book I'll be talking about is Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This starts out following two central figures, Mata and Kuni, two unlikely friends who lead a rebellion against the current empire. But it is also a sprawling story that involves several perspectives that make up an empire or that form a rebellion, as it's not just focused on one hero, one villain. We get the perspectives of the regent, engineers, a housekeeper, a female war strategist, just to name a few, the role of administration, and we also get the role of gods as well. At first, those chapters involving gods make the gods seem a bit distant, like they are just passively watching the story unfold. And as you go on in the book, they do seem to play a stronger role in the story. So I'm curious how that's going to develop throughout the series. One of the themes this explores is whether friendship or brotherhood can survive rises and falls in fortune. There's also the intersection between ambition and jealousy, and also whether prudence is a virtue or whether you need to gamble to win. There's also the idea of tactics and strategy versus brute force. And we also get a sense of delegation, how that plays a role, delegating power and understanding what we are working with. We're not just working with a rebellion, but where do we go from there? What is the greater picture afterward? While epic in scale, the story manages to be clear, cohesive. It has smooth modern fantasy prose, efficient characterization, and just enough setting, description, and detail and drama that doesn't settle. I also want to mention, though, that I don't know very much about Chinese history, but I have a friend who's Chinese, and she DNF'd this book halfway through because she felt like the historical influences of the story were too one for her. And so it was not a fun reading experience for her. Of course, she had to admit that the airships were neat, as they are, but I can understand why that didn't work for her. And so I want to go ahead and just add that in case you know about the influences that take place for this and that sets you off. Though I'm sure that this departs from history as well. I have heard from at least one other friend, maybe two other friends, who knew about the influences of this story and also were put off by it. So that might be a factor that could hurt enjoyment. I personally had a good time with this book. I thought it was fascinating the way it was constructed. I was a huge fan of Ken Liu's The Paper Menagerie, and I feel like his talent as a short story writer really does play a role in the way that he's able to write all these mini arcs that build up this story. And it was a bit predictable. I guess I could give it that. It was a bit of a predictable storyline. And that's saying a lot for me as someone who is terrible about plot predictions, but it was still enjoyable and fascinating, and I am looking forward to continuing on. The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold is a book set in the world of the five gods. There are three novels that follow one after another. This is the first of those. However, at the end of the Penrick's Demon novella I read last month, or in the month of January, I should say, Bujold does explain that you can read these as standalones, that they were actually intended to be standalones, but they also make sense if you read them in consecutive order, but you could read them technically in any order. So I want to go ahead and mention that in case you want to think of this as a standalone recommendation. And I'll also add that as soon as I started this book, I got strong Guy Gavriel Kay vibes. If you're a fan of Guy Gavriel Kay, then I highly recommend checking out Bujold's Curse of Chalion. Now, it did feel different for me after a while, but it still gave me enough of that vibe that I think fans of Kay would enjoy Bujold's writing. She is a gifted writer. I feel like she inserts the right amount of archaic medieval fantasy prose while still adding this beauty and flow to it and having such great characterization. Now, we are following in this book a seasoned veteran character named Kazaril. He's 35 years old, but he's been through a lot. I don't want to say too much about his character because I think Bujold does such an amazing job slowly drip feeding you information about him and his backstory at the right moments without heavy info dumping. So she seamlessly gets you into the story and gives you his backstory piecemeal, and everything about his backstory informs who he is in the present, the decisions he makes, and how the arc of the story is created. So it's just brilliant the way this character defines this story. And Kazaril right now, it has to be one of my favorite male fantasy characters at this point. He felt very well developed throughout this story. You see aspects of PTSD, but he also has this believable quality of discernment, of prudence, of humility, of worldly knowledge, and it feels earned. It feels authentic. And this plays an important role in the story because he's making his way to the castle where he had once been a page as a kid. And when he gets there, he is assigned to be the princess's secretary tutor, which is essentially like a mentor position. Now, the princess there is second in line to be heir of Chalion, and the story then involves moving to a different setting and a lot of inner politics that are at play against her and her brother who is the heir. The story involves demonic magic, it involves self-sacrifice, it involves that quality of discernment. That discernment quality is so important because it's something that Kazrael is trying to impart. He's trying to teach to the princess, and it comes out throughout the story in important ways that you can't trust what you see on the surface, but it also is brought up in a tragic way as the story continues as well. So this story has what I would say equal amounts of grit and dark elements, as well as beauty, heartfelt moments. I would say also a very powerful spiritual component as we are exploring the role of gods in this world. And there's also an intersection between what it means to be a saint and what it means to have a curse and a miracle. These things are kind of intertwined in a way that you wouldn't expect. This book manages to balance religious magic, political conflict, and hopeful character aspirations in such a seamless way. Something that I've been saying about this book is that usually in fantasy, we're used to seeing young protagonists and a mentor figure who comes in and out of the story, whereas in this story, we're closely following the mentor's perspective. So we're following Kazrael's perspective as the mentor or secretary tutor rather than the princess's perspective. But this leads to a couple of little nitpicks that I had with this book. They're not major ones and they are subjective, but I want to go ahead and mention them. The first one is that I felt like the middle section of the book was a little emotionally subdued for me. And part of this has to do with the fact that Kazrael is going through so much at that point in the story. And Kazrael, given his background, given what he's been through in his backstory, feels the need to be very even keel, very stoic, very reserved. There is at least one exception to this, but for the most part, he's trying to hold it together when he's going through a lot of stuff. And as a result of that, I felt like I wasn't getting as much emotion in that part of the story. And as much as I feel like he was the perfect character to tell this story, and I love the fact that we get the mentor perspective, I think it would have been helpful to get the princess's perspective, her name is Azelle, or maybe her maiden friend's perspective, just to get some other emotional perspectives into the story. Because like I said, I felt like it was very reserved, and it made sense why it was reserved. It made sense why he was trying to be such a good soldier, but I wanted a little bit more emotion during that section of the story. The second criticism I have is that I felt like Kazrael came up with a very simplistic plot solution, and I couldn't figure out for the life of me why he didn't think it through, why he didn't think through the possible negative consequences of what he was going to do or what he was going for. I mean, it was fine, but it was just something that I felt like was obvious. And then the third thing, and this is just another little nitpick, is that I could have used a map and glossary for this book. You're getting a lot of terms that are not exactly of our world. And I figured it out. I guess I figured my way out through the story. I didn't feel like the plot was too hard to follow, but there were a lot of moments where we're talking about characters or places that are not on the page. And I'm somebody, by the way, who does not usually use a map when I'm reading a book. I read The Grace of Kings, which has a great map, has a glossary, and I didn't use any of those things when I was reading the book. I had no problem navigating the story despite the multiple perspectives. And in Curse of Chalion, for whatever reason, I struggled. Eventually, I was smart enough to Google the map online, and that helped, but for some reason, I really struggled with this book. I remember feeling that way with Lions of Alrasan as well by Guy Gavriel Kay. I felt the need to look at the map, go back and forth with the map in that book, and it was very helpful. And I think that book also has a character list, which was helpful. So if you read this book, it might be helpful to look up a map and look up what the character roles mean in the story. It's not totally necessary to follow the storyline, but for me, I think it would have been helpful earlier on before I looked it up myself. And that's just about it, though. Overall, I'm very positive about this book. I think it's a great, slow burn, politically charged fantasy story with religious themes, great court politics. So if you're into that kind of thing, then you should definitely check it out. I want to mention that I was also part of a wonderful Curse of Chalion discussion over on Tori's channel with Tori, her husband Ben, Andrew Meredith, and Anita. Now I'm going to talk about the flop of the month for me, and that's going to be Made Things by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This book had such great potential. I loved the concept of this story as it was a tinkerer novella. I love the idea of a tinkerer fantasy story where we have a fantasy setting, we have magic, we have magicians, mages, but we also have these puppets, these mannequin type people, these little people who are basically sentient but made up of gadgets and clockwork. I think that is so fascinating. So we're following a character, a young thief named Moppet or Coppelia, and she has two of these little mannequins. To everyone else in the town, they are puppets, and she's a puppeteer putting on a puppet show, but she uses these two mannequins in order to help her do her thievery. Then eventually they all get involved in a heist together, and I don't want to say much more than that, except that I just couldn't get into this story for a couple of reasons. One, I feel like the heist plot was not that interesting to me, and I also felt like the character development wasn't there, but also I felt like the prose was clunky. There were several awkward sentences that made it very difficult to flow with this story. I had such a hard time getting into it. Eventually, I switched to the audiobook. Adrian Tchaikovsky narrates the novella himself, and so I think he had a good flow for the rhythm he was going for, but I still struggled with it. I still struggled to feel invested in it. And I love, again, the concept, the setting concept, the character concept, and I love the character names, by the way. Moppet, Auntie Countless. There's one character named Shabby. I thought that was neat, but sadly, this just didn't do it for me. And in fact, I had to go back to Guns of the Dawn, the only other book by Adrian Tchaikovsky I read, pick out a random excerpt, read that, and then admire what he could do again as a writer. Because this book was so different, obviously, and I do appreciate that about Tchaikovsky, that he could write in so many different settings or different types of stories, different genres. But unfortunately, this made me not interested in picking up another Tchaikovsky book anytime soon. City of Thieves is set in World War II in Leningrad. We are following a Jewish boy named Lev who is imprisoned by the Russian soldiers because he looted a German corpse, which is considered government property. And while he's there in the prison cell that night, he is put together with another young man, a man named Kolya, who is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very good-looking. The two are offered the potential of release if they are able to secure a dozen eggs for the colonel's daughter's wedding, which is to occur in a few days' time. This is, of course, at a time when food is extremely scarce and expensive, and the cold is brutal. But our character Lev is determined, he is desperate, and our character Kolya is extremely optimistic and a bit reckless. The journey is hazardous and shows horrors on both sides of the war, whether it's cannibalism, propaganda, cruelty, butchery, etc. There is some reflection or bonding, however, on the role of art on either side, so that of literature or music. In fact, my favorite moment in this book was one in which the characters are walking and they hear this piano music happening, and this leads our character Lev to reflect on music and its role in his life growing up, whether it was listening to Chopin or Mahler's Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, which, if you don't know, that song cycle has the same music as Mahler's First Symphony. And in fact, it opens with a Jewish wedding, like the music of a Jewish wedding. And I think that that particular scene led to some pretty powerful moments to follow. This story was extremely immersive for me. I listened to the audiobook and I felt like the dialogue was excellent. The narrator did an amazing job bringing everything to life. And I could visualize every scene in this book vividly, like I was watching a Netflix film. It obviously makes sense that the author of this book is a screenplay writer. That came across very clear to me as somebody who was listening to this book because I could picture everything. Unfortunately, I have to say that the end of this book was a huge flop for me. I feel like there were some plot conveniences that completely popped my suspension of disbelief. They were just way too extreme for my taste. Maybe some people will feel differently. Obviously, the average rating on Goodreads is quite high. So if you want to take that into account, obviously I'm in the minority here, but I just couldn't buy into it. I felt like it was stretching way too far. And maybe my threshold for that is a little bit lower when it comes to historical fiction than fantasy. Up until then, I did have a great time. So I'm sad to say that I was thoroughly disappointed with that ending. The Passion According to GH by Clarice Lispector is translated from Portuguese to English by Idra Navi. And I picked this book up thanks to Emily here on BookTube. I'm going to link her channel in the description. Go check her out. She's fantastic. I also picked up this book thanks to Generic Entertainment, who did a wonderful video and talked about this book. I'll link that below as well. Before going into the book, all I knew about it is that we have a woman who has an existential crisis after encountering a cockroach. And externally, the events of this book include woman sculptress in her house walking into the maid's quarters. She opens the wardrobe, sees the cockroach, squashes the cockroach, and only one other thing happens, but that's basically it. The rest of this book is stream of consciousness as the character is exploring identity. At the beginning of the book, you get the sense that she has been stripped of identity in some sense. She talks about losing this useless third leg, this sense of self, and she seems at once terrified of where she is at the moment, and at the same time, equally scared to gain back that sense of self. And so she seems to be drawn into this cycle of wanting to understand what it means to be, what it means to exist without constructions of identity, without constructions of morality. What is that primordial aspect of being? And she also cycles through questions internally, examining the inexpressible in art, error to find truth, neediness, depersonalization, deheroization, God as indifferent, and giving up as revelation, just to name a few things. There is so much more that's explored in this book. Although I would say that the external events in the story are very brief as far as what happens and what we encounter, there is a really powerful emotional arc to the story. At the beginning of the story, we have incessant questioning, and we do have this sense of psychological horror that continues to build and creep as you go on in the story, and it leads our character to do something that I won't mention yet. And so we do have this emotional arc that builds and builds and builds, and we have a resolution. And the resolution for me is something that I'm still trying to sit with and unpack. I feel like there's a lot to unpack in this story, and it was beautiful. I found so many beautiful lines throughout this book, but it wasn't a comfortable read. It wasn't easy to get through. It was confusing at times. It was tedious at times, which is funny because she does talk about tedium. And at the same time, it was horrifying, unsettling. It was also beautiful and poignant. So I found it oddly fulfilling, even though it's not one that I think many people will enjoy. And I'm going to go ahead and give away a spoiler now. And I don't know if it's much of a spoiler, honestly, but the big spoiler is that she decides she needs to eat the cockroach paste. And to her, she feels like by going towards the cockroach and eating the paste of the cockroach, she's finding some sort of sense of transmutation of self. Like this is the final step to transmuting identity. That was my understanding anyway. And she brings up this concept of the anti-sin, which I think again alludes to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Good and Evil, whereas sin is eating of the fruit and knowing the difference between good and evil. Maybe the anti-sin is bringing the unity back. That's my guess anyway. So she feels compelled to do this thing. And despite what she wants, she ends up screaming in horror and crying. And I was actually moved by the way she described the tears coming down her face as companions without any sense of self-pity. And from there, she seems to realize that she didn't need to eat the cockroach after all, that maybe the way being exists for her is different than being exists for the cockroach, whereas before she was trying to conflate the two. And she also starts to realize that love is ever present and the sense of neutrality that she's able to embrace. She realized that our destiny as human beings is to be needy and to search, to be seekers, but also ultimately to give up, and that giving up is the ultimate revelation. And there was something about that was beautiful to me. Even though, like I said, I don't know that I fully grasped everything, there were a lot of things about this book that made me think about non-duality, among other things. I also enjoyed the conversations in this book about aesthetics, as this woman is a sculptress. She's a female in Brazil at this time. And so she finds that stripping away self is also stripping away that need to be beautiful. There was some conversation about that in the book that I found pretty powerful. So I don't know what to make of this story, except that it was moving for me at times, and I'm glad I read it. Even though I can't widely recommend it, I'm glad I read it. That concludes my February wrap-up. If you watched this video this far, please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If there are any books I mentioned that you've read or that you want to read, please let me know. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.